Hello everybody, my name is Daulton Nelson and today I'd like to give my thoughts on a game I just beat, that game being Hover for the Nintendo Switch. Hover is a 3D platformer developed by Fusty Game and Midgar Studios. Fusty and Midgar are relatively new game studios. Both have done smaller projects in the past before Hover. Hover is also published by Palladius Games, who has published quite a few indie games before this one. I've known about Hover since 2014 when their Kickstarter went up and Jet Set Radio composer Hideki Naganuma announced through Twitter that he could be a part of the project. And while I didn't support it at the time as I wasn't making money, I've always kept a close eye on the project through its Twitter and its Kickstarter. Hover is heavily inspired by Smilebit's Jet Set Radio franchise published by Sega, and seeing how I loved playing through Jet Set Radio Future and how I loved both of the game's soundtracks, I was anticipating the day when Hover would come to consoles. So now that it is available to all modern consoles, I finally got my hands on this spiritual successor, and I really enjoyed my time going through it. I found the movement within Hover to be very enjoyable. Players have techniques like running, jumping, grinding, and wall running, as well as wall climbing and wall grinding to navigate through the levels. Players can also perform tricks while in the air to score combos and points. Mostly everything a player does contributes towards energy that they accumulate that, when full, allows the player to run faster, jump farther, and generally perform greater movement feats. This energy that they accumulate is called hover heat, which is probably what the game is named after, and thus is a central mechanic to the game overall, as having a low hover heat value has your character performing worse, with smaller jumps and such. Luckily, hover heat is pretty easy to accumulate, so a player will rarely have a low value of energy at any time. Players can also spray graffiti and tag walls just like in Jet Set Radio, as well as throughout the game, players will acquire materials that they can equip to their character. These enhance the player's abilities while having some minor debuffs to that material that they equip as well. Hover also allows the player to change into different classes of characters called DNA kits within the game, which each have their own base stats. I really like how players are able to customize their experience with these characters and the materials that they can equip. They can play with a character that has a really low jump stat, but then offset that by equipping materials that enhance jumping. Another main mechanic to Hover is scanning, which is mainly used to interact with objects and missions. At first it seemed as if this mechanic could disrupt flow, but the scan can also be boosted with materials, so players can move by an object quickly while still being able to scan through it. In fact, even doing something like sneaking around can be done quickly if the player experiments with their options. Speaking of sneaking around, some of Hover's obstacles take the form of cameras or sensitive floors. If the player triggers an alarm from any of these, they will be chased by the antagonists of the game, which are these robots that arrest people for trying to experience entertainment. If the player is caught by these robots, they'll be teleported to a detention tube somewhere within the area that they were caught in. If the player is caught 3 times in a row, the players are jailed, and they must escape their prison before getting back to the game. To avoid being jailed, players will have to find a satellite that they can scan that will erase their arrest record. With this, Hover is actually fairly forgiving if a player is caught or if they make a mistake. If you do make a mistake, like dropping down from where you were, you can rewind yourself back to that spot. Just be careful, as you keep the momentum you had going from when you began that rewind. Overall, all of these elements, when meshed together, make for a really fun platforming experience that rewards skill and experimentation from the player. Now, if you're going to have great movement like this within a game, you also need great level design. And Midgar and Fusty here bring 2 types of level design structures within Hover. First, there is the very open vertical levels that have these tall buildings that can be scaled using either their features, nearby smaller objects, or using a boost pad. These felt a little jarring to navigate at first, which is why the developers put these spy bots throughout the levels, which are disguised to teach you the ways that you can navigate your way up and down these levels. These are actually a pretty genius way to get the player familiar with these wide but compact 3D landscapes that can feel overwhelming. The other level structure that you'll find throughout Hover is a more streamlined, claustrophobic level design, where there are these open rooms that are connected by hallways. These levels are more in line with the level design that you would see in Jet Set Radio, where there are more obvious pathways and intentionally placed set pieces that are to be used to get to a specific point within the level. These can also be some of the more difficult levels within the game, because the developers have the type of room to craft some more clever workarounds to obstacles and workarounds to entire sections of the map. Speaking of maps, most levels within Hover come with a map that can be accessed within the pause menu, so getting your bearings within a level isn't too hard. I didn't have a problem with the level design. In fact, I like the variety between the two structures, as the levels themselves have been ordered in a way where you're always changing between the two structures. One of the things that I was highly anticipating from Hover was its music. After all, how I found out about the game was through one of my favorite video game composers of all time, Hideki Naganuma, who has previously worked on games like the Jet Set Radio franchise, Sonic Rush, Ollie King, as well as his work under the alias Skankfunk for certain other properties. Naganuma's frenetic, big beat techno style is brought to Hover in the form of 2 tracks, Never Forever and Heaven Up. Both are instantly recognizable and bring a lot of life and energy to the soundtrack. By comparison, the other composer of the game, Midgar Studios' Cedric Menendez, who brings a bit more of a funkier techno house approach that is a sound that, by comparison, is a bit more standard compared to Naganuma's cuts here. I don't think the two styles meshed together all too well, which is a shame, because if we're going to compare Hover to Jet Set Radio, those games have a much more varied soundtrack that still manages to sound cohesive throughout. In the context of the game, Menendez's tracks come off as background music that never really catches the ear, which I wasn't expecting given that I had bought Hover's soundtrack last year when the game first came out for PC. In the context of that standalone soundtrack, Menendez's cuts there sound a lot better with details, bass, and energy that seems to have been lost when brought into the game itself. Ultimately, the soundtrack of Hover, in the context of the game, just left me wanting more than what was presented here. Now, a very big part of the Hover experience here is the amount of side content that the player can experience. There is a lot. Races in the game sees you completing laps against either AI opponents or other players that are playing with you. The AI within these races aren't really a challenge, so these races become more about how you can navigate through them if you're playing alone. There are also these small little challenges to conquer throughout the game, like the spy bots that I mentioned earlier, or propaganda posters that you can tag, or satellites that you can tag, to even these small little game systems sprinkled throughout that are really hard to find. One of the low points within the side content that I found was the gamer ball challenges. These are a lot like basketball, where the players have to get the ball to a small goal on a certain side of the map to score points. Whoever has the most points within the time limit wins. Unfortunately, with Hover's movement mechanics and level designs, I found these to be more chaotic and frustrating than fun. These challenges also caused the game to slow down a bit, maybe because of the amount of players. One thing that should have been turned off by the devs when playing these challenges is the particle trails that the players leave when they move within the game. In this instance of the Gamer Ball challenges, these trails presented a lot more of a visual clutter and no doubt contributed to the slowdown that would happen throughout these challenges. When completing any mission within the game, that completion nets you a couple materials based on how you did, and completing either a mission or smaller challenges will add value to your rank. Now, rank is a number that I guess represents how much you and your gang has done within the game. Sometimes when progressing through the game, a certain rank is required in order to move on, meaning that you would have to do optional content in order to progress, which is never really a good thing when it comes to game design. I would rather the developers just let the player progress how they wish, rather than restricting them like this. And ultimately, it kind of feels like you're artificially padding the game. Plus, I never really found why they really felt like they needed to do this. I always found a lot of the side content to be really fun to play through. I don't think they really needed to force the players to play through the side content in order to progress through the main part of the game. I do have some other things of note when looking at Hover. The story I found to be unremarkable, as most of it is a copy of Jet Set Radio's story beats. The ending of the game didn't really offer any closure, as nothing really happens in the ending, and the game comes off as confused as to who the antagonist really was. The UI of the game was obviously not changed between the PC version and the console versions, and thus, it didn't really flow very well, and I found that the in-game UI got in the way more than it was helpful. There were also visual glitches in Hover, with the camera popping through walls, or sometimes game objects would just disappear. I would also say that hover isn't very stable. There would be times where I would start wall running without me instigating the action, or sometimes I would get stuck on things that weren't really there. I had a friend who was playing the PS4 version of the game who reported that he was clipping through walls on that version, and I have no real reason to doubt him. Now, a Switch-specific problem that I had with hover is how the gyroscopes within the Joy-Cons were used within the game. Mostly, they are used to look around while scanning or throwing, but the devs for some reason use both gyroscopes at the same time while this is happening. It makes the camera during this action a little hard to control. And speaking of the camera is hard to have access to during hover because of how the buttons are laid out on controllers. Sections where players are grinding are like taking a leap of faith, hoping that the camera would auto-adjust fine, but while doing so, your right thumb is holding the grind button, and thus you can't use the right stick to move the camera to where you want it to be. I also think that the initial values that are used are definitely not right in some way. For example, the camera starts out way too close to the character, and it is a bit too sensitive. I spent a good chunk of the beginning of my playthrough in the settings trying to get the camera to a somewhat tolerable state before ultimately turning down some of the settings all the way. Also, in my opinion, hover suffers from an identity crisis. Fusty and Midgar are definitely wearing their influences on their sleeves here. But the problem is when playing hover, I was never able to point to something within the game and not think about another game as I was playing. I say that there are about 6 influences here, 2 of which were pointed out to me by the Twitter handle @JetSetRadioLive. There is the obvious Jet Set Radio influence with the movement, the level designs, and the plot. There's a Crackdown influence here with the open vertical levels, character growth, and aesthetics. There's a Mirror's Edge influence with the parkour and the first-person mode. There's a Borderlands influence with the textures and the loading screens and the containers and the side content. As for the 2 influences that were pointed out to me, there's a Phantasy Star Online influence with the multiplayer, which I didn't get a real chance to try out yet, as well as an aesthetic influence within Futurama. I'd say that the most creative things visually in the game are the character designs, which are diverse and inspired. But even with the few flaws that I've listed out here, I ended up really loving hover. There aren't many games that are this fun to just move around in, and that use that movement as a main focal point for many of the challenges and scenarios throughout a playthrough. So that's why I'm going to give hover a final score of a 7 out of 10. While not the most original or well-made game released this year, hover brings a lot of fun moments that revive a mechanical aesthetic that hasn't been seen since the early 2000s. And thus, while not unique within games history, is definitely unique now within the contemporary gaming sphere. And so that concludes my review of Hover. I definitely recommend the game, even with its flaws. I plan on playing the multiplayer at some point with my friend, so if I have anything to say about that, I'll bring that up later. In the meantime, you can like, comment, or subscribe if you like my reviews. I also have social media links in the description below, as well as my Portfolium, where you can see what I've done. And with that out of the way, please make sure to have a nice day.